You know that VisualPolitik is one of the few political channels that pays a lot of attention to Latin America, one of the least covered regions in the world. Perhaps that is why many of you have often asked us to talk more about Latin America. Well, we've got a solution. We're proud to present LatamPolitik, a newsletter that we have prepared together with geopolitical consulting firm Perch Perspectives. If you subscribe every month, you will receive 12 newsletters with the best information and analysis on Latin America to keep you up to date and better understand everything that is happening in this region. The cost? You can subscribe for less than 35 cents per newsletter, less than a small taco or a donut a week. In return, you'll be kept up to date on all major happenings in the region and better understand all the possible implications. In addition, all of you who support us at Patreon level 4 and 5 will receive LatamPolitik at zero cost. You can find all the info at latampolitik.com. Dear friends, if I were to ask you what you think about what is known as the welfare state, that is public services in China, I'm pretty sure that we would have two main options. Some of you would likely think that it must be a huge welfare system, super welfare, with lots of coverage and free things covered by the government. After all, China is, in theory, a socialist country, but others might think that the opposite is true, that surely there are practically none of these things at all in the Asian supernation, that we are talking about a country that is obsessively focused on reducing labour costs, and that, no matter how socialist it may claim to be, when it comes down to it, the worker has no more status than that of a production machine. Well, to all of you who have either of these views, I'm sorry to say that you're both wrong. The idea we have today of a welfare state, that is, a series of social insurance and coverage paid in whole or in part by the state, did not exist in China until the 1990s, and initially began as an experiment at the local level. In fact, in the land of the Red Dragon, the role of the state as guarantor of minimum social protection is a recent development, and does not resemble either European or East Asian systems. What's more, if we were to make a comparison, perhaps one of the most similar systems would be, paradoxically, that of the United States. Yes, that's what I said. Now, what exactly does the welfare state of the People's Republic of China look like? How has it evolved over the recent decades? To answer these questions, dear friends, the first thing to do is to start, of course, at the beginning. So yes, that means it's also time to say, let's look at some history.
A system in constant evolution.
The Chinese welfare state, let's call it that for the sake of simplicity, did not really exist as we know it now until the 1990s. In any case, it could be said that it has gone through three periods. The first, which was enforced between 1949 and 1978, was known as the Central Planning Period, and is the one that characterized Mao Zedong's social policies. The second is often referred to as the pro-growth economic policy and lasted from 1978 to 2003. And the third and current one is known as social harmony. What's behind all these fancy names? Well, you see, the first one, the Central Planning, was a pseudo-welfare system inspired by the Soviet Union to be a fundamental part of the construction of a socialist economy. As a consequence, since unemployment was seen as a defect of capitalism, the regime assigned employment to all able-bodied Chinese citizens of working age, lifetime employment in state enterprises and agencies, government departments, collective farms, and so on and so forth. These work units were called danwei and were organised under the formula of state enterprises or cooperatives. A sort of self-sufficient mini-welfare state was organised around them, consisting of three main elements: life tenure, known as the Iron Rice Bowl, equal pay, and a social assistance package. The latter was managed directly by each danwei and provided unit workers with housing, access to education, healthcare, stores, and other services. But wait a minute, because while all this may sound more or less positive, keep in mind that we're talking about a China where 89% of the people lived in extremely poor rural areas, where there was not even enough food for everyone, so the quality of these services, well, as you can imagine, it left a lot to be desired. Moreover, the fact that lifetime employment, housing, and a series of social services linked to the danwei were provided was not at all altruistic. In this way, the Maoist regime ensured, also thanks to the hukou system, that it controlled where the population lived and what they worked on. Not only that, the hukou gave the regime the ability to move huge masses of labour from the countryside to the cities to meet the needs of industry, a sector that Mao was promoting in the image of the Soviet 5-year plans. So what exactly is hukou? Well, it is basically a unique Chinese family registration system, and although it has evolved somewhat, in practice, it has always served to establish a huge barrier to, for example, moving by choice from the countryside to the city, as well as linking social services to the place of birth instead of the whole country or the place where you work. That is, despite being a Chinese citizen, in practice, you may only have a right to healthcare or education or unemployment or a pension in one place, but not in any other. Something that has affected and continues to affect workers who migrate from the countryside to the cities. But we will talk about all this a little later on. The point is that by 1978, China had already suffered several economic and political crises, and was also lagging far behind the Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. And in that very same year, as we've already covered in a video that I'll link in the description, a series of reformist politicians came to power, led by Deng Xiaoping. And yes, in addition to carrying out the now famous reforms towards state capitalism, or towards a kind of market socialism, call it what you want, they also modified the system of social benefits that, to put it bluntly, no longer fit with the new system that was to be put in place. You see, along with the dismantling of collective structures after the economic reforms, social protection for the villagers disappeared, including the old health cooperatives. Most rural clinics became private, and many low-income rural people were left unable to access even basic healthcare. In the cities, the policy of forced full employment was replaced in 1986 by individual contracts, and companies were relieved of their welfare obligations. This meant that, at first, many surplus workers were laid off, leaving them highly vulnerable, thus increasing urban poverty. In addition, Mao's idea that economic growth was directly dependent on population growth made this transition much worse and more difficult, because suddenly there was a lot of surplus human capital, which was immediately corrected with policies such as the one-child policy, established in 1979. The fact is that by the end of the 80s, the regime had been focused for too many years on internal political reforms, leaving aside the social situation of a population that had not had a great time before, and was now having an even worse time dealing with all the changes that were being implemented. As you know, changes usually entail a transition period, especially when those changes are very gradual and slow, but carry a lot of significance. Not surprisingly, social unrest, strikes, and the risk of political collapse posed by the reforms towards state capitalism that had just been set in motion forced the government to design a new welfare system with a simple, pragmatic vision. Let's say that the majority political understanding at the time was that if all these social needs were not addressed as soon as possible, and violence, crime, and conflict increased, not only could the reforms be derailed, but the very power of the Chinese Communist Party could collapse. So by the late 80s and early 90s, the state stopped focusing on political reforms and started to give priority to the issue of social protection. Of course, in a very, very different manner from what those of you who are watching us from old Europe are used to. At that time, a social security system was established with the intention of reducing the burden of care for the Danwei, so that together with businesses, the employees and the state would also share the costs. This in itself would also help boost the competitiveness of Chinese corporations. At the end of 1991, a Housing Provident Fund, a compulsory savings fund, was created first in Shanghai, and then in 1995 at the national level, with the objective of facilitating people's access to housing. In the same vein, low-interest loans were also established for mortgage loans. In 1994, Labour law introduced a new welfare state framework that included, among other things, a system of public subsidies for the poorest, social welfare payments, and compulsory individual superannuation savings accounts to complement the public pension system. As you can see, all these increases in social support in China are relatively recent, as much of the current system was built in the 1990s. However, the truth is that all these reforms, despite their reduced scope, played an essential role both in consolidating the power of the Communist Party and in boosting and settling the middle class. Now at this point, I'm sure many of you are already wondering, okay, this is all well and good, but what exactly does the Chinese welfare system look like now? What is left of the past, and how does it work in the present? Well, let's take a look.
Not as socialist as you thought.
Let's be honest, describing the Chinese welfare system is a titanic task, because more than being one system, it is a system of systems, with different coverage, benefits, and privileges, depending on where you live and what field you work in. But to simplify it, we can say that the current system is organised into three pillars: social assistance, social insurance, and welfare services. First, social assistance is direct aid to the poorest people, and its main component is the minimum livelihood guarantee, a kind of minimum cash income managed by local authorities and which differs according to the area where the individual lives. Incidentally, the majority of Chinese workers who migrate from rural areas to cities for work are excluded from this assistance. Secondly, we have the social security system, which is a very difficult puzzle to manage and is under the central government spotlight due to successive corruption scandals and a lack of control over funds and beneficiaries. This system is composed of several insurance and pension plans. For example, we have the basic retirement pension, which covers up to 60% of the salary that was earned while working, as long as the individual has contributed for more than 15 years. It is a graduated system, i.e. if you have only contributed 15 years, you receive around 15% of your former salary as a pension, and for each additional year of contributions, this percentage increased by 1%. This pension system is financed through employee and employer contributions. Then there is a parallel system of rural pensions, similar to the company system, but with a collective subsidy from the government that replaces the employer's contribution. In addition, these pensions are lower than those of the company system. But it doesn't end there. There is also a lot to be untangled on the issue of health insurance, which is yet more gibberish. This insurance is actually composed of at least 3 different types, for other urban employees and for rural cooperatives. The latter, created in 2003, is voluntary and has enabled 97% of rural population to have access to healthcare. Health insurance is also paid with contributions from the worker and the employer. But perhaps the most surprising feature for many of you is that in China, there is no universal and free healthcare, at least not in the way that there is in some countries in, for example, Europe. In fact, despite being covered by health insurance, there is a health co-payment whereby the public health insurance only covers about 60% of the costs. What's more, medical centres do not necessarily have to be public. In fact, there is a growing network of private hospitals and clinics throughout China. Then of course, there is also private health insurance, which is becoming more and more common and often serves as a complement to improve the quality of care and cover the part of the co-payment that is not subsidised by the state insurance. And yes, in China, women also have paid maternity leave, with a 98-day leave paid 100% by employers and which compensates for the loss of income during maternity leave. But let's move on. In China, there is also unemployment insurance, jointly financed by the worker and the employer, as in most countries. It covers up to 24 months with basic assistance and, depending on the location, may or may not include medical expenses. Finally, there is the third pillar, which is welfare services, aimed at the poorest, the orphans, the disabled, and the most disadvantaged elderly. Well, in theory, these are the pillars of the welfare system that the Chinese government offers. As you can see, it is much more lax and externalized system than you would expect in a supposedly socialist country. And that's not all, because as you know, theory is one thing and practice is another. Listen up.
A model riddled with holes.
The Chinese welfare system, if we think about it as a public social system in a country that wants to be something like the champion of a social system overcoming capitalism, has 2 big problems. It still covers too few people and it is very discriminatory. Look, for example, at this graph. As you can see, of all urban workers, less than 70% pay pension contributions, only 44% pay unemployment benefits, and barely half pay health insurance. But if this already seems too little, look at what happens with migrant workers. Only 22% pay pension contributions, the same percentage for health insurance, and only a meager 17% participate in unemployment insurance, according to the Chinese government data. But hold on a minute, how does what we're telling you fit in with headlines like this?
Over 95% of people in China have basic medical insurance, CGTN.
Well, the truth is that these headlines are not lies, but they're not exactly true either. For example, migrant workers with their hukou in rural areas of origin are technically covered by the rural cooperative medical system, but are not covered in the urban areas where they live and work. That is, it may be true that 95% of the Chinese population is covered by some form of health insurance, but the percentage that can actually benefit from the coverage where they work is much lower. And take note, because this is not something that can be overlooked. At the end of 2019, for example, there were nearly 300 million Chinese migrant workers who had left the countryside for the city in order to improve their standard of living. So you can imagine how many people are left out of the Chinese government welfare system. In other words, around 1/6 of the Chinese population is exposed to higher levels of precariousness than the population registered in urban Hukou. However, another thing to note is that this situation is very convenient for the government, as it keeps statistics sky high without the need to provide additional funds. After all, if 300 million people have moved from countryside to the city, you don't need to provide health infrastructure for all these people, as they're technically covered in their places of origin. These guys could make the disastrous Nikola Corporation profitable, even if it meant deducting hypothetical revenues from potential future customers. You never know. And let's add that if you don't have a formal contract, you are excluded from social services beyond your place of origin. Do you understand the problem now? On the other hand, another challenge, as mentioned before, lies in the management of the system itself. Even several of the Chinese government's own audits confirm that the welfare system is riddled with irregularities. Irregularities such as the failure of many companies to contribute, the improper payment of benefits to ineligible persons, and the misappropriation by local authorities of social security funds for other purposes. Nevertheless, China's welfare system, according to official statistics, is in surplus, although these same statistics show that the system, especially the pension system, faces a serious problem of viability due to the lack of capital accumulation. Or in other words, although there are individual mandatory savings accounts, in practice, the pension system basically functions as a pay-as-you-go system, whereby today's contributions cover today's needs. The initial idea was to create a system similar to Chile's or Singapore's, where mandatory savings funds and social contributions were capitalized, but this has not yet been achieved. So there you have it, the broad outline of the welfare state in the People's Republic of China. It is an insurance-based system with a strong presence of private players in the provision of services, which in general terms is more similar to the US system than to those of the European social democracies. A model, by the way, with very few public benefits, and one that is subject to many limitations, making a large number of Chinese citizens basically excluded. That said, the economic growth that China has recorded since reforms were first launched in 1978 has not only led to an incredible reduction in poverty and a huge improvement in the living standards of Chinese families, but has also allowed news like this to happen.
25th of February 2021, Xi Jinping declares extreme poverty has been wiped out in China. President says 850 million people have been lifted out of destitution in an unprecedented accomplishment. SCMP.
But at this point, it's your turn. What do you think of the current Chinese welfare state? Did you expect it to be like this? Or did you imagine that it would be much more public and state-run? Let us know your thoughts below in the comments. And if you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Once again, thank you for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.